Welcome, students, to today's Explainer. All right, let's just dive right into this because today we are unpacking one of the absolute most defining and honestly most complex debates in modern American history. You see, the world changed fundamentally after the tragic events of September 11, 2001. In the aftermath of those attacks, the United States was forced to face an incredibly difficult question. How do we prevent something like this from ever happening again? And maybe more importantly, what price are we actually willing to pay to do it?
To really wrap our heads around the weight of this dilemma, I want you to imagine something hyper-personal. Think about your bedroom. What if, to guarantee that you would never, ever get hurt while inside your own house, your parents decided to just take your bedroom door completely off its hinges? They tell you, hey, it's the only way we can monitor everything and keep you perfectly safe. And sure, you'd never be in danger, but you'd also never have a private conversation, a private moment, or a space to truly call your own ever again. That uncomfortable, kind of squeamish feeling you might have right now, that perfectly illustrates the massive national trade-off between being perfectly monitored for security and losing our personal privacy.
So, at a national level, this dilemma really boils down to a massive tug-of-war. On one side, you've got argument A. Sacrificing some freedoms is simply a necessary trade-off. The logic here is that if the government can't see what the bad guys are doing, they literally cannot stop the next catastrophic attack. But then, on the exact opposite side, we have argument B. Stripping away our core civil liberties destroys the very democratic values this nation was built to protect. The counterargument is basically, if we give up our freedom just to feel safe, hasn't terrorism already won?
Now check out this data from the Pew Research Center to see exactly where the American public stood right after the attacks. Back in the mid-90s, the vast majority of people felt it was absolutely not necessary to give up their liberties. But look at that huge spike. By January 2002, 55% of Americans actually believed it was necessary for the average person to give up some civil liberties to curb terrorism. Fear is a hugely powerful motivator, right? And it drastically shifted the nation's priorities practically overnight.
So, here is our roadmap for today's lesson. First, passing the Patriot Act. Then, testing the limits. Third, echoes of the past. Fourth, the human cost. And finally, key vocabulary.
All right, Section 1, Passing the Patriot Act. Let's look at the legislative response. Driven by that widespread fear of terrorism we just saw in the polls, Congress acted swiftly. I mean, very swiftly. They created a brand new executive department, the Department of Homeland Security, and they passed a massive piece of legislation known as the Patriot Act. Now, I want you to look really closely at the full name of that law. It stands for the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. It is a massive, carefully constructed acronym designed specifically to project a sense of strength and security during a time of intense national panic. But what were those appropriate tools actually doing? Well, the Patriot Act radically expanded government powers. It authorized vastly increased surveillance. We're talking making it much easier to intercept wiretaps and monitor emails. It allowed for warrantless searches of bank accounts, business records, and phone data using things called national security letters. It even authorized what they called sneak and peek warrants, which meant the government could secretly search a suspect's property without even notifying them right away. The fundamental rules of government surveillance changed literally overnight.
And you know, this wasn't just digital surveillance happening behind the scenes. It was physical security too. The creation of the Transportation Security Administration, or the TSA as we all know it, brought intensive new screenings to airports across the country. Physical pat-downs and full-body thermal or X-ray scanners became the new, everyday normal for anyone trying to board a flight. Your physical privacy at the airport was traded in for the assurance that no weapons were making it onto a commercial plane.
Let's move on to Section 2, testing the limits. How did the Supreme Court push back?
Think about the concern perfectly captured in political cartoons from that era. You'd see things like the executive branch depicted as a king-like figure sitting up in a tree on a branch labeled the three branches of government. And what is he doing? He's using his wildly expanded commander-in-chief powers to literally saw off the very branch he's sitting on. It is a fantastic visual for a major concern critics had at the time. By giving the president sweeping, unchecked authority to hunt down terror suspects, were we actually destroying the constitutional checks and balances that hold our entire democracy together?
Fortunately, our system of government is specifically designed to push back, and the Supreme Court did eventually step in to test the limits of these new powers. In 2004, with the case Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, the court ruled that even if a U.S. citizen is captured fighting for the enemy, they absolutely cannot be detained indefinitely without due process. They still have constitutional rights.
That same year, in Rasul v. Bush, the court stated that even foreign terrorist suspects have the right to legally challenge their detention. And in 2006, with Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, the court firmly reminded the president that he cannot just create military tribunals on his own. Only Congress has that power. The big takeaway here? Even in a global war on terror, the Constitution still applies.
Which brings us to Section 3, Echoes of the Past, looking at historical parallels.
As chaotic and unprecedented as the post-9/11 era felt, it actually wasn't the first time America faced this trade-off, not by a long shot. I want you to dust off your history books for a second. Where have we heard this exact argument before? When else in American history has the government argued that it desperately needs to restrict personal freedoms and civil liberties in order to manage a major crisis?
The truth is, this is a recurring American dilemma. We saw it way back in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts. We saw it during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. We saw it during World War I with the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And tragically, we saw it during World War II with Executive Order 9066, which forced over 100,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. And that was based entirely on fear and racial prejudice rather than any actual evidence of treason. So when we look at the post-9/11 trade-off, it's really just the latest chapter in a very, very long historical book.
Now for Section 4, the human cost, the societal impact of these policies.
When the rules of engagement changed to prioritize getting intelligence at literally any cost, it led to some incredibly dark places. Take, for example, the method known as waterboarding. The U.S. government initially classified this, along with other harsh methods, as enhanced interrogation techniques. However, there was, and honestly still remains today, an intense, heavy controversy over whether these techniques cross the legal and moral line into outright torture. It raised some profound, uncomfortable questions about exactly what values America was willing to compromise in the name of security.
And we have to remember, the human cost wasn't just felt overseas or in secret military prisons, it was felt deeply right here at home. Looking at data from the FBI and Pew Research Center, the reality is stark. In the year 2000, there were 12 reported anti-Muslim assaults in the U.S. But in 2001, fueled by post-9/11 anxieties and a massive surge in Islamophobia, that number spiked tragically to 93. And that tension didn't just fade away after a year or two, it fluctuated and eventually hit 127 assaults by 2016. The widespread fear of terrorism had a massive, devastating collateral impact on totally innocent Americans.
And this domestic tension continued well into later administrations. We saw debates over border security, strict vetting, and discrimination flare up again during the Trump administration, specifically with executive actions that sought to temporarily ban entry to the U.S. from several predominantly Muslim countries. This ongoing, incredibly complex debate, how to properly balance real national security threats with civil rights and non-discrimination, continues to shape our modern elections and our national policies today.
Finally, Section 5, Key Vocabulary. Let's lock in some terms to remember.
Grab your notebooks. Make sure you write these down for your exams. First up, the Patriot Act, the 2001 law expanding government surveillance and security powers to stop terrorism. Next, civil liberties, the basic individual rights and freedoms protected by the Constitution from government interference. Third, due process, the legal requirement that the state must respect all legal rights owed to a person. And finally, habeas corpus, the fundamental right of a person under arrest to be brought before a judge or into court to determine if their detention is actually lawful. Make sure you have these locked in. And that brings us to the end of today's explainer. But before you go, I want to leave you with this final thought. The generation that lived through 9/11 made their choice. In a time of extreme panic, they leaned heavily towards security. But as technology advances at lightning speed, as our phones track our every location, and as surveillance becomes even more sophisticated, security or privacy, which will your generation prioritize? Will you keep the bedroom door off its hinges, or will you demand to put it back on? Thanks for learning with me today, and I'll see you in the next lesson.